What if the greatest spiritual battle in your life is not happening outside your house, but inside the room where you sleep? What if some of the things you have grown comfortable with are quietly blocking God's peace, power, and protection over your life? Stay with me, because before this message ends, you may realize that removing one small thing could unlock a massive spiritual breakthrough. Beloved, listen to me carefully. Many people pray for peace, but they sleep in a place that is spiritually polluted. They ask God for rest, but their bedroom is filled with distractions, fear, and compromise. Your bedroom is not just where your body rests, it is where your spirit is most open. That is why the enemy attacks people at night. That is why dreams matter. That is why God speaks when everything is quiet. And today I feel a strong urgency in my spirit to warn you in love, because God desires your bedroom to be a place of peace, protection, and divine encounter. Stay with me until the end of this message, because the fourth item I will share is the one most believers ignore, and it is silently stealing their spiritual strength. Your bedroom is far more than a physical room with four walls, a bed, and a door. It is one of the most spiritually sensitive spaces in your entire life. When the lights go off and the noise of the world fades, your spirit becomes quiet, open, and receptive. This is why sleep is not only physical rest, but spiritual exposure. In those hours, your guard is lowered, your thoughts slow down, and your heart becomes tender. Scripture shows again and again that God speaks when people are still, when distractions are removed, when the soul is calm. That is why your bedroom functions like an altar, whether you recognize it or not. An altar is simply a place of encounter, and every night you lay your body and spirit there. What makes an altar holy or polluted is not the size of the place, but what is placed upon it. In ancient times, people carefully prepared altars because they understood that whatever happened there affected their future. Today, many believers pray passionately in public but ignore the condition of the place where they sleep. They ask God for peace during the day while allowing confusion to dominate the atmosphere at night. They wonder why they feel spiritually drained, why their dreams are troubled, why anxiety greets them in the morning, without realizing that the altar of rest has been neglected. The bedroom is where thoughts are processed. It is where memories replay. It is where fears speak the loudest. If this space is not spiritually guarded, it becomes an open door. The enemy does not need permission to attack loudly if he can whisper quietly in the dark. That is why many spiritual battles happen in private, not in public. You can be strong in front of people and still be vulnerable when you are alone. God understands this, and that is why He desires your bedroom to be a place of covering, not conflict. In the Bible, God often met His people in moments of rest or solitude. Jacob encountered God when he lay down to sleep and heaven opened above him. Samuel heard the voice of God while lying down in the house of the Lord. Even Jesus withdrew to quiet places to pray and rest. These moments were not accidental. Stillness creates sensitivity. Silence sharpens hearing. When the body rests, the spirit listens. This is why the atmosphere of your bedroom matters so deeply. Everything in that room contributes to the spiritual climate. Just as temperature affects the body, atmosphere affects the soul. Peace does not happen automatically. It is cultivated. Protection does not exist by chance. It is established. When you understand that your bedroom is an altar, you begin to treat it with intention. You become careful about what enters that space, what remains there, and what leaves an imprint on your spirit night after night. Many people underestimate how spiritual environments work. They think faith only operates during prayer or worship, but faith is active at all times. The spirit does not turn off when the body sleeps. Dreams, impressions, and inner thoughts are all part of spiritual communication. That is why a polluted atmosphere can produce restless sleep, recurring nightmares, or heaviness without a clear reason. On the other hand, a consecrated space can produce clarity, rest, and even divine instruction. God is not interested in making rules to restrict you. He is interested in creating conditions where you can flourish. When He warns about environments, it is because environments shape outcomes. What you allow around you will eventually influence what rises within you. If your bedroom is filled with chaos, your inner world will struggle to remain calm. If it is filled with peace, your spirit will learn to rest even during storms. Treating your bedroom as an altar also means recognizing authority. In spiritual terms, whoever controls the altar influences what manifests. When you surrender that space to God, you are making a declaration that your rest belongs to Him, your dreams belong to Him, your nights belong to Him. This is powerful because many attacks come when people are exhausted. Rest is not laziness, it is warfare. A rested believer discerns better, prays clearer, and walks stronger. There is also a covenant aspect to this. Night after night you return to the same place. Over time that place absorbs patterns. Just as words spoken repeatedly shape a mindset, spiritual conditions maintained consistently shape an atmosphere. If worry dominates the bedroom, anxiety becomes familiar. If prayer and peace are present, calm becomes natural. The altar remembers what is offered on it. That is why God often instructed his people to tear down old altars before building new ones. Your bedroom should not be a place where your faith goes to sleep. It should be a place where your spirit is renewed. When you enter that room, your soul should sense safety. When you lie down, your heart should feel covered. This does not happen by accident. It happens when you recognize that God cares about private spaces as much as public ones. He is Lord of the secret place, not only the visible stage. When believers begin to understand this truth, their relationship with rest changes. Sleep becomes an act of trust. Lying down becomes an expression of surrender. The night is no longer feared but embraced as a time of restoration. The mind is trained to release burdens instead of carrying them into the dark. The heart learns that God works even while the body rests. If the enemy can disturb your rest, he weakens your resistance. If God governs your rest, he strengthens your foundation. This is why Scripture says God gives his beloved sleep. It is a gift, not a struggle. It is a blessing, not a battle. But gifts must be received in the right environment. An altar prepared for God invites his presence, and where his presence dwells, peace becomes natural, clarity becomes frequent, and strength quietly grows while you lie still, breathe slowly, and your spirit remains open, receptive, and aware of the sacred nature of the place where you rest night after night, shaping what you carry into every new day without realizing how deeply the altar has been influencing your life, your thoughts, your reactions, and your faith in ways that continue unfolding each time you return to that space again. Many battles people face are not loud or obvious. They do not announce themselves with visible crises. They operate quietly, subtly, often hidden behind ordinary objects, habits, or memories that seem harmless. This is why hidden things matter so much in the spiritual realm. What is concealed from human attention is not concealed from spiritual influence. In Scripture, again and again, God warns his people that unseen compromises create unseen conflicts. When something is allowed to remain hidden, it often gains power not because it is strong but because it is ignored. Hidden objects are powerful because they shape atmosphere without demanding attention. A visible threat can be confronted, but a hidden one works in silence. Many believers pray sincerely, worship passionately, and still experience inner resistance they cannot explain. They feel blocked in prayer, uneasy at night, heavy without cause. Often the issue is not their faith but their environment. Spiritual battles do not always begin with temptation. Sometimes they begin with tolerance. What you tolerate quietly can eventually trouble you deeply. Objects themselves are not magical, but association gives them meaning. Throughout biblical history, God commanded his people to remove items that carried spiritual allegiance to other powers. Not because the material itself was alive, but because what it represented invited influence. Spiritual authority responds to alignment. When something in your space aligns with fear, pride, lust, or false worship, it becomes a legal ground. The battle begins not when you believe in it, but when you give it space to remain. Many people say, "I don't believe in that anymore." Yet they keep reminders, symbols, or objects tied to old seasons, old sins, or old belief systems. Spiritually, memory has weight. Objects connected to past bondage can reopen doors that were once closed. This is why God instructed his people not to keep spoils from defeated enemies. The victory was real, but the leftovers carried contamination. Hidden battles often come from unfinished obedience. There are also emotional objects that create spiritual tension. Letters, gifts, images, or items tied to pain, betrayal, or unhealthy relationships can hold emotional residue. Every time the eyes see them, the heart remembers. Every time the heart remembers, the spirit reacts. Over time, this reaction becomes normalized, and the person wonders why peace feels distant. The battle is not happening because God is absent, but because the space is divided. Hidden battles thrive in divided spaces. God does not compete for territory, he governs where he is welcomed fully. When an environment carries mixed signals, the spiritual atmosphere becomes unstable. Just as a house with conflicting foundations will crack under pressure, a room filled with spiritual contradictions produces inner unrest. This unrest may appear as anxiety, distraction, temptation, or spiritual dryness, but its root often lies in what has been allowed to stay unchallenged. The enemy prefers hidden access over open confrontation. Open confrontation can be resisted, prayed against, and rebuked. Hidden access slowly drains strength without triggering alarm. This is why Scripture emphasizes light. Light exposes, and exposure removes power. Anything that must be hidden to remain is already operating against peace. God never requires secrecy to bring blessing. Darkness, however, depends on concealment. Some battles are tied to objects that glorify fear or violence. Images, media, or symbols that constantly project darkness shape the subconscious. Even when consciously ignored, the spirit absorbs patterns. Fear planted repeatedly becomes expectation. Violence normalized becomes desensitization. The battle then manifests not as an external attack but as internal numbness, restlessness, or agitation. The person does not feel attacked, they feel unsettled. Other hidden battles come from objects tied to pride or identity distortion. Items that feed ego, comparison, or unhealthy self-focus slowly shift spiritual posture. The heart moves from dependence to self-reliance. Prayer becomes less urgent. Humility becomes less natural. The battle here is subtle because it feels like strength, but it produces distance. God resists pride not out of anger, but because pride blocks intimacy. There are also battles connected to words stored in the environment. Notes, writings, or recordings that reinforce hopelessness or negativity continue speaking long after the moment has passed. Words do not expire automatically. They linger until replaced. When negative declarations remain in a private space, they become background noise to the soul. Over time, that noise shapes belief, and belief shapes expectation. The battle then appears as discouragement without a clear cause. Hidden battles are dangerous because they feel personal rather than spiritual. People blame themselves, their personality, or their circumstances, not realizing that the environment is influencing the struggle. God, in His mercy, warns not to shame but to protect. Removal is not punishment, it is relief. When an object leaves, the atmosphere shifts. When the atmosphere shifts, resistance weakens. When resistance weakens, clarity returns. Spiritual cleansing is not superstition, it is alignment. Just as physical cleanliness affects health, spiritual order affects peace. God is a God of order, not confusion. Confusion thrives where boundaries are blurred. Hidden objects blur boundaries because they exist without being acknowledged. Once acknowledged, they lose secrecy. Once secrecy is broken, authority can be restored. This is why obedience must reach private spaces. Public faith without private alignment creates tension. God does not demand perfection, but He does require honesty. When a person invites God to search hidden places, battles lose their hiding spots. The heart becomes lighter, not heavier. The spirit breathes easier, not tighter. Peace begins to return in small but noticeable ways, such as calmer thoughts, clearer dreams, and a quieter inner world. Hidden battles often end not with dramatic deliverance, but with simple removal. Something leaves the room, and something lifts from the soul. The connection becomes clear only after the weight is gone. This is how God restores gently, not through fear but through awareness. He reveals not to accuse but to heal. When the hidden is brought into the light, the battle loses its advantage, and the atmosphere begins to respond to truth, alignment, and freedom that continues unfolding as the space becomes clearer, quieter, and more responsive to peace, while the heart slowly adjusts to the absence of conflict it had grown used to without ever realizing it was fighting at all. Obedience is not merely an action, it is an atmosphere. Wherever obedience is practiced consistently, a spiritual climate is formed that invites divine movement. God responds not only to words spoken in prayer, but to the posture of the heart expressed through obedience. Many people want God to move powerfully in their lives, yet they overlook the simple truth that God moves most freely where He is honored without negotiation. Obedience is not about control, it is about alignment. When alignment is present, resistance weakens, clarity increases, and spiritual sensitivity sharpens. Atmosphere is shaped by agreement. When your choices agree with God's instructions, the environment begins to cooperate with His presence. This is why Scripture connects obedience with blessing, peace, and protection. It is not that God withholds goodness when people disobey. It is that disobedience disrupts the conditions necessary for goodness to flow. Just as planting requires the right soil, God's movement requires a receptive environment. Obedience prepares that environment quietly and consistently. Many believers misunderstand obedience as a one-time act rather than a daily posture. True obedience is woven into habits, decisions, and attitudes. It shows up in what you allow, what you remove, what you prioritize, and what you surrender. Over time, these choices create an atmosphere that either invites God's nearness or limits spiritual sensitivity. God does not force himself into environments where his guidance is repeatedly ignored. He waits patiently for alignment because alignment signals readiness. When obedience is present, peace becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a condition. The heart no longer wrestles constantly with conviction. The mind no longer debates what it already knows is right. This inner agreement produces rest. Rest is not inactivity. It is confidence that you are walking in harmony with God's will. In such an atmosphere, prayer becomes less strained and more natural. Worship becomes less forced and more sincere. Spiritual disciplines shift from obligation to desire. Obedience also establishes authority. Authority in the spiritual realm is not granted by position but by submission. Those who submit to God's order carry clarity and confidence that cannot be imitated. When a person obeys God even in small matters, they signal trust. Trust invites responsibility. Responsibility opens doors to influence. This is why God often entrusts greater insight to those who are faithful in unseen choices. Obedience in private strengthens authority in public. Atmospheres formed by obedience are resistant to chaos. Life does not become free of challenges, but challenges lose their power to dominate. Fear may knock, but it does not take residence. Temptation may appear, but it does not control direction. Confusion may arise, but it does not linger. The atmosphere itself resists intrusion because it is ordered. God is a God of order, and where his order is honored, stability follows. Many people seek dramatic encounters while neglecting consistent obedience. They want God to move suddenly, but God often moves steadily. Obedience creates continuity. It keeps the spiritual environment stable enough for growth. Sudden change without stable alignment often leads to confusion, but steady obedience produces lasting transformation. The atmosphere becomes predictable in the best sense, marked by peace, clarity, and spiritual awareness. Obedience also sharpens discernment. When a person chooses God's way repeatedly, their spirit becomes trained. They recognize what belongs and what does not. Distractions lose appeal. Compromises become uncomfortable. This discomfort is not condemnation, it is protection. The atmosphere itself begins to warn before danger fully arrives. This is how God guides gently, not through fear but through sensitivity developed over time. Disobedience, on the other hand, does not always produce immediate consequences, which is why it is so deceptive. The atmosphere may seem unchanged at first, but subtle shifts occur. Peace becomes harder to access. Prayer feels heavier. Spiritual focus scatters. These are not punishments, they are signals. God uses atmosphere to communicate alignment. When obedience weakens, the atmosphere reflects that tension. When obedience returns, the atmosphere responds quickly. God desires to dwell where he is welcome through action, not just intention. Intention without obedience creates frustration because the heart wants one thing while the environment supports another. Obedience resolves this conflict. It brings the inner and outer worlds into agreement. This agreement releases flow. When flow is present, spiritual growth feels natural rather than forced. Atmospheres shaped by obedience also affect others. Peace carried within spreads outward. Clarity influences conversations. Stability calms relationships. People may not understand why they feel safe or refreshed around someone, but they are responding to an environment shaped by alignment. Obedience multiplies impact without effort. It allows God to work through a person without constant striving. This is why obedience is deeply connected to freedom. Freedom is not the absence of boundaries, it is the presence of right ones. Boundaries guided by God protect what matters most. They guard peace, preserve clarity, and sustain spiritual strength. When boundaries are honored, the atmosphere remains clear. When they are ignored, the atmosphere becomes crowded and tense. God moves where he is trusted. Trust is proven through obedience. Every obedient choice is a quiet declaration that God knows better, sees further, and desires good. This declaration shapes the environment. Over time, the atmosphere becomes receptive, responsive, and alive with expectancy. Not because of perfection, but because of consistency. God does not require flawless obedience. He responds to willing obedience. As obedience becomes habitual, the atmosphere becomes predictable in its fruit. Peace returns quickly after disruption. Clarity follows uncertainty. Strength renews after fatigue. These patterns reinforce trust. Trust deepens obedience. The cycle continues, strengthening the environment day by day. This is how God moves steadily, shaping lives not through pressure, but through alignment that allows His presence to settle, remain, and influence everything within that space, as obedience quietly continues to shape the atmosphere without noise, force, or visible effort, allowing God's movement to flow naturally through consistency, trust, and surrender that deepen with every aligned choice made in awareness of His nearness and authority.